Tonight, take a deep breath, relax, and let us slowly explore the story of salt. Just salt. That plain, white, ordinary substance sitting in a shaker on your kitchen table. The one you barely think about when you reach for it. The one that has been there, quietly, for as long as you can remember. But salt has a story. A very, very long story. And if you will settle in, get comfortable, maybe pull the blanket up a little, I would like to tell it to you. There is no rush. We have all the time in the world. So, salt. Let us begin with a small contradiction. Salt is made of two things that would, on their own, be quite dangerous to you. The first is sodium. Sodium is a soft, silvery metal, and it is deeply unstable. If you dropped a little chunk of it into a glass of water, it would not dissolve quietly.
It would hiss.
It would skitter across the surface, and then it would burst into bright, violent flame. Sodium reacts with water the way a cat reacts to a bath, with immediate and total hostility. It is the kind of element that chemistry teachers handle with great care and thick gloves. The second ingredient is chlorine. Chlorine is a pale greenish-yellow gas. You might know it from swimming pools, where a small amount is used to kill bacteria. But in high concentrations, chlorine is poisonous. It burns the throat and the lungs. It was in fact used as a chemical weapon in the trenches of the First World War. It is not the sort of substance you would want to sprinkle on your dinner. And yet, when these two volatile, dangerous things find each other, something quiet happens. They bond. Their atoms settle into a calm, orderly lattice. They form a crystal. And that crystal is sodium chloride, NaCl, also known as table salt. Two dangerous elements combining to make something essential, something your body cannot live without, something you have been eating your entire life without a second thought. It is also, as far as we know, the only rock that human beings eat on a regular basis. Think about that for a moment. We do not eat granite. We do not eat limestone, but we eat halite. We eat rock salt. We have always eaten it, and we always will. Now, why do we need it so badly? The answer lies inside you. Right now, as you listen to this, your body is quietly humming with tiny electrical signals. These signals travel along your nerves, from your brain to your muscles, from your eyes to your fingertips. They tell your heart when to beat. They tell your lungs when to breathe. And the substance that carries these signals, the conductor of this private orchestra, is salt. Your body is in many ways a vessel of salt water. The fluids inside you, your blood, the liquid between your cells, the tears in your eyes, carry the same basic chemistry as the ancient oceans where life first appeared, hundreds of millions of years ago. We carry the sea inside us. Sodium ions and chloride ions flow through your blood, your tissues, the narrow spaces between your cells. They are the electrolytes that make the whole system work. Sodium, in particular, drives something called the sodium-potassium pump. This is a tiny mechanism in every cell of your body that regulates how much water flows in and how much flows out. Without it, your cells would lose their balance. Some would shrivel, others would swell and burst. It is not a dramatic process. You would never feel a single pump at work. But if all of them stopped, you would not last very long. And chloride, the quieter partner, has its own essential role. It helps form the hydrochloric acid in your stomach, which is how you digest food. It helps move carbon dioxide from your tissues to your lungs so you can breathe it out. The trouble is, your body cannot make sodium. It cannot synthesize it from other materials, and you lose it constantly through sweat, through tears, through the ordinary daily processes of being alive. Every day, a little more salt leaves your body, and every day you must replace it. You are tethered to salt. You have always been tethered to it. This need is not unique to humans. Not at all. Out in the wild, animals feel it too, perhaps even more keenly. Carnivores, wolves, lions, bears, get their sodium from the meat they eat. Blood is salty. Muscle is salty. If you eat enough of it, you are fine. But herbivores, the plant eaters, have a problem. Plants contain very little sodium, and so animals like deer, elephants, moose, and cattle are driven by a deep, instinctive craving to seek out natural salt deposits. These are called mineral licks or salt licks. They are patches of exposed earth, rich in sodium and calcium and magnesium, where the soil has a faintly briny taste. If you have ever watched a deer standing in a forest clearing, licking patiently at a patch of dirt, that is what you are seeing. A creature answering a biological call that is millions of years old. These salt licks became gathering places, hubs of animal activity, sometimes for thousands of years. Generations of animals returning to the same spot, wearing grooves and trails into the earth with their hooves. And predators, of course, followed. Where the deer gathered, the wolves gathered too. And where the wolves gathered, the earliest human hunters gathered as well. The trails that millions of hooves wore into the ground over thousands upon thousands of years, those trails became the first paths that early humans followed. Hunting paths, then trading paths, and eventually the very first roads. So in a way, salt drew the first lines on the map of the world. Now, where does all this salt come from? The answer is, in a word, oceans, but not the oceans you know today. The salt beneath the earth is the fossilized remains of seas that vanished long, long ago. Imagine, if you can, a time deep in the Earth's past, hundreds of millions of years ago during the Paleozoic era. The continents were in different positions then. The climate was different, and scattered across the globe there were vast, shallow seas, inland bodies of salt water, cut off from the open ocean by shifting tectonic plates. The sun beat down on these enclosed seas, year after year, century after century. The water evaporated, and what was left behind, accumulating slowly on the sea floor, was a thick bed of crystallized minerals. Salt. These deposits can be enormous. In the Michigan Basin of North America and in the Permian Basin of Europe, ancient salt beds lie thousands of feet thick beneath the surface. Thousands of feet. Entire landscapes of salt, buried under the weight of the ages. They are a geologic archive, a record of ancient worlds written in crystal and sealed in stone. Over millions of years, these salt beds were buried deeper and deeper under layers of limestone, shale, and dolomite. The weight above, the overburden, pressed down on them with immense force. And salt, under enough pressure and enough time, does something rather unexpected. It behaves almost like a liquid. It flows. In places like the Gulf Coast of the United States, and in Iran, and in Romania, this pressurized salt was squeezed upward through weak points in the rock above, forming massive vertical structures known as salt domes or diapirs. Some of these domes are miles deep and miles across. They push up through the surrounding rock like slow, silent pillars rising over geological time, and curiously, the spaces around these salt domes often trap pockets of oil and natural gas. Which is why the history of salt mining and the history of the oil industry are, in some places, the very same story. There is even a more exotic theory about how some salt deposits formed. Deep in the Earth's crust, there is a process called serpentinization, in which certain types of rock absorb water, and in doing so concentrate the surrounding fluids into highly saline brines. This might explain why some massive salt deposits exist in places where surface evaporation seems unlikely. But regardless of the method, Whether the salt was baked by the sun on the floor of a shallow sea or squeezed from deep rock by subterranean chemistry, every grain of salt you have ever tasted is a geological artifact, a tiny piece of a world that no longer exists. A crystal older than the dinosaurs, older than the first forests, older than almost anything you will ever touch. And that, perhaps, is the first quiet wonder of salt. For most of human history, people did not need to think much about salt at all. During the long era of the Paleolithic, the Old Stone Age, which lasted for hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors were hunters and gatherers. They roamed. They followed herds. They fished in rivers and lakes. They ate meat, wild game, fish, the blood and organs of animals. And meat, it turns out, contains enough sodium to keep a human body running quite well. If you eat a reasonably meaty diet, your salt needs are met without any effort at all. But then something changed. Slowly, over many generations, beginning around 10,000 years ago, people began to settle down. They cleared small patches of land. They planted seeds. They grew wheat and barley in the Near East, rice in the river valleys of China, millet in Africa, maize in the Americas. They domesticated animals, sheep, goats, cattle, but their diets shifted heavily toward plants, grains, vegetables, cereals, roots. And these foods, while nourishing in many ways, are naturally low in sodium and high in potassium. This was the Neolithic Revolution, the birth of agriculture. And it brought with it a quiet crisis that most history books do not mention. People were no longer getting enough salt from their food. Their bodies craved it, a deep, gnawing, instinctive hunger that could not be ignored, could not be reasoned away. It was biological, cellular, as fundamental as thirst. And so for the first time in human history, people had to figure out how to make salt. The earliest evidence of deliberate salt production comes from a place called Poiana Slatinei Lunca in the dense forests of Romania. Archaeologists working at this site found the remains of a salt-making operation dating back to around 6,050 years before the Common Era. That is more than 8,000 years ago, long before the pyramids, long before writing, long before any of the civilizations we usually think of as ancient. What those Neolithic people did was remarkably simple and remarkably clever. In the forests of Romania, there are natural springs where the groundwater is salty. These are brine springs, places where underground water has passed through deep salt deposits and become saturated with dissolved sodium chloride. The spring water tastes briny, salty, and if you collect that water and boil it, the water evaporates, and what is left behind, clinging to the inside of the pot, is crystallized salt. That is exactly what they did. They poured the brine into ceramic vessels and heated them over fires. When the water was gone, the salt remained trapped inside the pottery. And to get it out, they simply broke the pot. These ceramic vessels are called briquetage, and fragments of them, thousands and thousands of shattered pots, have been found at salt-making sites all across Europe. It was the standard technology for millennia. Boil the water, break the pot, collect the salt, start again. Simple, patient, repetitive work carried out by countless hands over countless generations. Halfway around the world, and perhaps just slightly later, the same thing was happening in China. At a site called Zhongba in the Three Gorges region along the Yangtze River, people were boiling brine in large pointed-bottom ceramic vats. Over the centuries, as the practice refined itself, the shape of the vessels changed. They went from big vats to smaller pointed-bottom cups and finally to rounded-bottom jarlets. This evolution of pottery is not trivial. It tells us that salt was being standardized. The cakes were becoming uniform in size and shape, easy to count, easy to carry, easy to exchange. They were becoming, in effect, a unit of trade. The sheer volume of broken pottery found at Zhongba is staggering. This was not a cottage industry. This was not a single family making salt for their own use. This was production on a commercial scale, organized and sustained over centuries. Salt was being made here for export across the entire Sichuan basin. And trade, of course, brings wealth. And wealth brings complexity, specialization, hierarchy, the beginning of what we might eventually call civilization. Even in Britain, recent discoveries at a place called Street House in North Yorkshire have pushed the timeline of salt production back much further than anyone expected. Excavations there revealed a salt production facility dating to around 3,800 years before the Common Era, the Neolithic period, long before the Bronze Age, when most historians used to think British salt making began. These early Britons utilized brine storage pits and stone hearths to process seawater, extracting their salt from the cold grey waters of the North Sea. Salt production, it seems, was one of the first true industries of the human species. Wherever people farmed, wherever they ate grain instead of game, the need for salt arose. And wherever the need arose, someone figured out how to meet it. Now let us travel to China, to the province of Sichuan. Because what happened there is one of the most quietly remarkable stories in the entire history of engineering. And it is a story that very few people outside of China have ever heard. Sichuan is an inland province. It is ringed by mountains on 3 sides and lies far from the sea. There are no coastal salt pans, no convenient ocean from which to harvest brine. But deep beneath the surface of Sichuan, there are vast underground reservoirs of ancient brine, salty water trapped in the rock, the remnant of seas that dried up millions of years ago. The question was how to reach it. Around 250 years before the Common Era, under the governance of a man named Li Bing, who was also famous for designing the Dujiangyan irrigation system, one of the great engineering achievements of the ancient world, Chinese engineers began drilling wells to tap these underground aquifers. At first, the wells were dug by hand. Laborers descending into the earth with picks and shovels, carving out shafts through the rock. But the technology advanced quickly. During the Qin and Han dynasties, the hand-dug wells gave way to a percussion drilling system that was, for its time, extraordinarily sophisticated. Here is how it worked. A heavy iron drill bit, shaped for a specific purpose, was attached to a long cable. A team of men would climb onto a large wooden plank mounted on a fulcrum, like a seesaw. They would jump. Their combined weight would lever the drill bit high into the air. Then, as they stepped off, the heavy bit would crash back down into the rock, pulverizing it. Inch by inch, day after day, different drill bits were used for different stages of the work. One was called the fishtail, designed for opening the initial hole. Another was called the silver ingot, shaped for rapid drilling through softer layers. The names are rather lovely, I think, like characters in a story about patient, grinding labor. By the 2nd century of the Common Era, the drillers had made a crucial improvement. They switched from hemp ropes to bamboo cables. Bamboo is remarkable. It is light, enormously strong for its weight, flexible enough to coil without breaking, and most importantly, resistant to the corrosive effects of brine. Hemp cables would rot and snap. Bamboo endured. They also developed bamboo tubes fitted with leather valves that served as balers, long hollow cylinders that could be lowered into the well and pulled back up, filled with brine. It was a complete extraction system built almost entirely from organic materials found in the local landscape. And then came the truly remarkable discovery. Deep in these same wells alongside the brine, the drillers sometimes struck pockets of natural gas. In many places and many eras, this would have been seen purely as a hazard, an explosive danger to be avoided. But the salt makers of Sichuan saw something else entirely. They saw fuel. They captured the gas. They piped it through hollow bamboo lines, sometimes over considerable distances, to their evaporation pans. And there they used the Earth's own energy to boil the Earth's own brine. This was industrial-scale salt production powered by natural gas, piped through bamboo, happening in China more than 2,000 years ago. The scale grew steadily over the centuries. By 1835, the Shanghai well in the city of Zigong had reached a staggering depth of 1,000 meters, over 3,300 feet, making it the deepest borehole in the world at that time. All drilled by hand. All powered by human muscle and the patient rhythm of jumping men on a wooden plank. It is the kind of achievement that makes you want to sit quietly and think for a while. But salt in China was never just about engineering. It was about power, about money, about the relationship between the state and the people. The idea of taxing salt, of using it as a tool of governance, goes back to a philosopher named Guanzhong, who served the Duke Huan of the state of Qi in the 4th century before the Common Era. In a famous dialogue recorded in the Guanzi text, Guanzhong made an argument that rulers would find irresistible for the next 2,000 years. If you tax the people directly, he said, they resent you. They see the tax collector at the door and they feel the weight of the state's hand on their shoulder. But if you tax salt, something every single person needs every single day, something no human can refuse to buy, then the tax becomes invisible, unavoidable. It hides inside the price of a necessity. Even children consume salt, even the elderly. A salt tax catches everyone, including those too young or too old to pay any other kind of tax. It was, in its way, a kind of genius, and it was put into full practice in the year 119 before the Common Era, when Emperor Wu of the Han dynasty decided to nationalize the salt industry. Emperor Wu needed money. He was fighting expensive wars against the Xiongnu nomads on the northern frontier, and the treasury was strained. Salt was the answer. The state seized control of all salt production. Private merchants could buy the right to transport and sell the salt in assigned territories, a system called official supervision, merchant transportation. But the salt itself, from the moment it crystallized in the pan, belonged to the emperor. This monopoly lasted in one form or another for 2,000 years, through the rise and fall of dynasties, through invasions and civil wars and reunifications. Salt revenue flowed into the imperial treasury like a quiet, steady river. In some periods, like the Tang dynasty, salt taxes accounted for more than half of the entire government's income. More than half. Imagine a modern nation funding its entire military, its bureaucracy, its infrastructure with a tax on a single mineral. That was China. But there was always a cost. The monopoly kept salt prices artificially high, and that created a black market. Salt smugglers, sometimes organized into gangs, sometimes called salt bandits, became a persistent feature of Chinese life. The punishment for smuggling salt could be extraordinarily severe: prison, exile, death. And yet people still smuggled because the need was real and the state's price was too high. In some provinces, the black market salt was better quality and cheaper than the government's product, which made enforcement a kind of grim comedy. The health of the salt monopoly became a barometer for the health of the Chinese state itself. When the government was strong and its administration competent, the monopoly ran smoothly and the revenue flowed. When the dynasty began to weaken, when corruption spread and local officials skimmed from the top, smuggling would explode, revenues would drop, and the decline would accelerate. Salt, in China, was never just a mineral. It was the pulse of the empire. And if you knew how to listen to it, it could tell you whether the dynasty was thriving or dying. Let us drift now to Egypt, to the dry heat of the Nile Valley, to a civilization that was, above all else, obsessed with permanence. The ancient Egyptians understood something fundamental about salt. It stops decay. If you pack a piece of meat in salt, the moisture is drawn out. The bacteria that cause rot cannot survive without water, and so the meat is preserved. It can last for weeks, for months, for years. It does not change. It endures. For a culture that believed in an eternal afterlife, that believed the soul would need its body intact in order to live forever, this quality was deeply, profoundly meaningful. If salt could preserve food for the living, could it also preserve the body for the dead? The answer was yes. But the substance the Egyptians used for mummification was not ordinary table salt. It was natron, a naturally occurring mineral mixture harvested from the dry beds of desert lakes, particularly a place west of the Nile Delta called the Wadi Natron. Natron is a blend of sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate, with traces of regular salt and sodium sulfate mixed in. It is highly hygroscopic, meaning it absorbs water with great efficiency, and it is alkaline, which means it can break down fatty tissues through a process called saponification. Experiments by modern archaeologists comparing natron to ordinary sea salt on organic tissue have confirmed what the Egyptians knew empirically. Natron dries the body faster and more thoroughly, leaving the tissues in a stable, leather-like state. It is simply better at the job. When a body was prepared for the afterlife, it was packed in dry natron, not soaked in a liquid bath, as some earlier scholars believed, but buried in the dry mineral powder within the embalming workshop. There it would remain for a period often cited as 40 to 70 days. Slowly, patiently, the natron drew out the water. The fats were saponified, and what was left was a body reduced to something almost mineral itself, a shell, dried and preserved, ready to house the soul across the vast stretches of eternity. Beyond the tomb, natron served the living as well. It was used as a household cleaning agent. It was used as a kind of mouthwash, dissolved in water. It was used as an early soap mixed with oil. In Egypt, the boundary between hygiene and holiness was thin, and salt, in its various mineral forms, walked that line with quiet dignity. At roughly the same time, far to the east, another great civilization was building its own relationship with salt. The Indus Valley civilization, centered around the cities of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, in what is now Pakistan, flourished from about 2500 to 1500 years before the Common Era. These were sophisticated cities. They had orderly, grid-planned streets. They had covered drains and public baths. They had large buildings that some archaeologists interpret as granaries, places for storing enormous quantities of food. And storing food in a hot climate requires preservation. It requires salt. The salt came from the coast. The Rann of Kutch, today a vast seasonal salt desert in western India, was, in the Indus era, likely a navigable waterway or an archipelago, rich in salt water that could be evaporated under the sun. At sites like Padri in Gujarat, archaeologists have found evidence of solar salt production. The crystals harvested there were transported inland through the dockyards of a port city called Lothal, up the rivers and trade routes to the great cities of the interior. It was a supply chain, a network of interdependence between coast and heartland, with salt as the preservative thread that held the civilization together. The fish from the coast, salted and dried, fed the craftsmen and laborers of the interior. The minerals and finished goods of the interior flowed back to the coast. And salt made the connection possible. And then there was Rome. The city of Rome was not chosen at random. Its founders, whether they were Romulus and Remus or, more likely, a collection of Latin and Sabine farmers, settled in a spot that offered something beyond a good hill to defend. Rome sat near the salt pans of Ostia at the mouth of the Tiber River, where seawater could be channeled into shallow basins and left to evaporate in the Mediterranean sun. The very first Roman road, older even than the famous Appian Way, older than the great highways that would eventually crisscross an empire, was not built for legions. It was not built for conquering generals or marching soldiers. It was built for salt. It was called the Via Salaria, the Salt Road. It carried salt from the coastal pans at Ostia inland into the Sabine Hills, where people needed it and did not have their own supply. Control of this road and control of the salt it carried gave Rome an economic grip on central Italy. Salt was a tool of diplomacy and leverage. If a neighbor cooperated, the salt flowed freely and at fair prices. If a neighbor made trouble, the supply could be tightened. It was a soft form of power, but an effective one. Now, you have probably heard the story that Roman soldiers were paid in salt. It is one of those facts that gets repeated in every trivia book and dinner party conversation, and it is almost certainly not true, at least not literally. The word salary does come from the Latin salarium, which is undeniably related to sal, meaning salt. And the Roman writer Pliny the Elder did write that the soldiers' pay was originally salt. But modern historians and linguists are fairly confident that Roman soldiers were paid in coins, proper money. The salarium was more likely a specific monetary allowance, a stipend given to soldiers to cover the cost of buying salt and other provisions. Or perhaps it was a vestige of a very old, pre-monetary custom, preserved in language long after the practice itself had disappeared. Still, the linguistic connection between salt and wages was so deep in the Roman mind that the phrase survived. A soldier who did his job well was said to be worth his salt, and that is a phrase we still use today, 2,000 years later, without really thinking about why. Rome managed salt as a state utility. The actual production was often leased to private contractors, called publicani, but the government kept a close watch on prices. Salt needed to be affordable. The common people, the plebeians, needed it to preserve their food through the winter. And when money was short, as during the Punic Wars against Carthage, the censors did not hesitate to manipulate salt prices to raise funds. It was a quiet reminder that in Rome, as in China, salt was always more than just a seasoning. It was a lever of state power hidden in plain sight on every table. Now let us cross the ocean. Let us leave the old world behind and travel west to the Americas. Because on this side of the world, civilizations built their own salt economies entirely independently of anything happening in Europe or Asia or Africa. The Americas had no contact with those continents for thousands of years, and yet the same needs arose and the same ingenuity was brought to bear. For the Maya, whose diet relied heavily on maize and beans, foods rich in carbohydrates but low in sodium, salt was not a luxury. It was a survival need. The flat, arid coastline of the Yucatan Peninsula, with its shallow lagoons and blazing sun, was the perfect place to produce it. The Maya called salt their white gold, and they were not being poetic. They meant it literally. In the inland cities of the jungle, far from the coast, salt was as valuable as any precious stone. In Belize, underwater archaeologists working at the Paynes Creek salt works have uncovered something remarkable. Preserved in the waterlogged peat of a mangrove lagoon, they found the remains of wooden buildings, salt kitchens. These structures date to the classic Maya period, and inside them were thousands upon thousands of ceramic fragments. Briquettage, the same basic technology, boiling brine in clay pots, breaking the pots to retrieve the salt that had been used in Romania 6,000 years earlier and in China 4,000 years earlier. Independently invented on the other side of the world. The salt was shaped into standardized cakes, uniform in size and weight, easy to count, easy to stack, easy to load into a canoe. Maya traders paddled these salt cakes along the coast and up rivers, deep into the forested interior, to cities like Tikal, one of the great metropolises of the ancient Americas. There, the salt cakes served not only as food, but as a form of currency. You could buy things with salt, and the stone tools found at the salt works show something else. Under microscopic analysis, the wear patterns on the tools match those produced by cutting fish, which means these were not just salt factories. They were integrated processing centers, salt production and fish preservation happening side by side. Salted fish for the inland trade, a vital source of protein for the vast populous jungle cities that had no ocean of their own. Further north, the Aztec Empire, the Mexica as they called themselves, took a different and rather more aggressive approach to salt. The Aztecs produced their salt in the basin of Mexico by a method called leaching. They would collect saline soil, earth saturated with mineral salts, soak it in water to dissolve the sodium chloride, then boil the resulting brine in ceramic vessels. They also harvested a natural mineral called tequisquite, a salt mixture that was used not only for cooking but for dyeing textiles. But what makes the Aztec salt story truly striking and rather chilling is how they used it as a weapon. The Tlaxcalans were the Aztecs' enemies. They were a neighboring people who resisted Aztec domination, and the two were locked in a conflict that lasted for generations. For over 70 years, the Aztec Triple Alliance enforced a blockade against Tlaxcala, and one of the primary tools of that blockade was salt. The Aztecs cut the Tlaxcalans off from every source of salt they could reach for 70 years. Imagine eating every meal every day for your entire life without a single grain of salt. It was not just a military tactic. It was a form of slow, grinding biological humiliation, a reminder at every bland and flavorless meal of who held the power and who did not. The Aztecs revered salt so deeply that they had a goddess devoted to it. Her name was Huixtochuatl. She was honored with elaborate festivals involving dancing, singing, and ritual combat. And at the climax of the festival, a woman, dressed in the likeness of the goddess, adorned in her colors and symbols, was sacrificed. Salt, in the Aztec world, was sacred enough to demand a human life. Back in Europe, the medieval period gave rise to one of the most extraordinary monuments to salt ever created. In southern Poland, near the old royal capital of Krakow, there is a salt mine called Wieliczka. It has been in continuous operation since the 13th century, over 700 years, and for much of that time, it was one of the primary sources of revenue for the Polish crown. Salt from Wieliczka paid for the construction of Krakow's fortifications. It funded the Jagiellonian University, one of the oldest in Europe. It was, in every meaningful sense, the financial bedrock of the kingdom. But what makes Wieliczka truly extraordinary is not the salt it produced, but what the miners built inside it. Spending their entire working lives underground, in the dim light of oil lamps and later candles, the miners carved the salt itself into an underground world. They made chapels so they could pray before and after their shifts. They made statues of saints and kings. They carved ballrooms where, on special occasions, the miners and their families could dance. The most famous of these underground spaces is the Chapel of Saint Kinga, located more than 100 meters below the surface. It is a cathedral carved entirely from salt. The floor is salt. The walls are salt. The columns and archways are salt. The chandeliers that hang from the ceiling are made of salt crystals cut and polished to catch the light. And the walls are decorated with bas-reliefs of biblical scenes, including a rendering of the Last Supper, all carved from the living rock salt by miners who were, in their own quiet way, also artists. There is a legend about how the mine was discovered, and it is a lovely one. It involves a Hungarian princess named Kinga who was betrothed to a Polish prince. Before leaving her homeland, she threw her engagement ring into a salt mine in Hungary. When she arrived in Poland and the miners broke open the very first lump of salt pulled from the ground at Wieliczka, there, inside it, was the ring. A miracle, a blessing, a symbol that the salt wealth of Hungary had followed the princess to her new home. It is almost certainly not true, but it is a beautiful story. And the chapel carved in her name, deep beneath the Polish earth, is real. In France, salt tells a different story entirely. A story of injustice, resentment, and eventually revolution. Beginning in the 14th century, the French crown imposed a tax on salt called the gabelle. It was not a new idea. Rulers had been taxing salt for thousands of years, as we have seen. But the French gabelle was uniquely, almost deliberately cruel in its design. France was divided into 6 different tax zones, and each zone had a different salt price. In the regions around Paris, the so-called Pays de Grandes Gabelles, the tax was crushing. Citizens were not merely allowed to buy salt at a high price. They were required to. A minimum purchase was mandated. You had to buy a set amount of expensive government-controlled salt every year, whether you wanted it or not. But in other regions, Brittany, for example, salt was essentially tax-free. A person in Brittany could buy salt for a fraction of what a person in Paris paid for the exact same substance. You can imagine what happened next. The price difference between zones created an irresistible incentive for smuggling. And smuggle they did. Men and women known as faux saunières, false salt sellers, trafficked salt across provincial borders, carrying it hidden in clothing, in hollow carts, in the false bottoms of barrels. It was, for all practical purposes, a low-level civil war between the smugglers and the salt tax collectors, the gabellers. The state's response was harsh. Thousands of salt smugglers were arrested, tried, and sentenced. Many were sent to row in the king's galleys, a punishment that was effectively a slow death sentence. Others were simply executed. But the smuggling never stopped, because the injustice of the system was too obvious, too deeply felt. Why should a family in Paris go hungry because they cannot afford salt, while a family in Brittany salts their food freely? The hatred of the gabelle was universal, and it was deep. It simmered for centuries. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789, the grievances of the common people were collected in documents called the Cahiers de doléances. The gabelle was one of the most frequently cited, and one of the very first acts of the Revolutionary National Assembly was to abolish it. The salt tax, symbol of the old regime's contempt for the common people, was among the first things to go. Let us now follow the salt as it moves. Because the story of salt is also a story of journeys. Long, slow, patient journeys across deserts and oceans, carrying this humble mineral from the places where it was found to the places where it was needed. In the medieval period, the Sahara Desert was not an empty wasteland. It was a highway, perhaps the most important commercial highway in Africa. And the cargo that drove this highway, more than anything else, was salt. Deep in the heart of the desert, in places with names like Tagaza and Tau Deni, there were mines. Not gold mines, not copper mines, salt mines. Enormous deposits of rock salt, buried beneath the sand, cut into massive slabs by the laborers who worked there in conditions that were, by any measure, brutal. Tagaza itself was said to be built entirely of salt, the walls of the buildings, the roofs, because there was nothing else to build with in that desolate place. Even the water was scarce and had to be brought in by caravan. The salt slabs were heavy. A single block could weigh as much as a grown man, and they were loaded one by one onto the backs of camels. The caravans that carried this salt were enormous, sometimes numbering 1,000 camels or more, stretching out across the dunes in a long, slow, plodding line. They crossed the Sahara heading south toward the savanna lands below the desert's edge. In those lands, in the great empires of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, salt was desperately scarce. The tropical climate was wrong for salt production. The soil did not contain it. Rivers ran with fresh water, not brine. But what those empires did have, in staggering abundance, was gold. Gold dust washed from riverbeds. Gold nuggets pried from the earth. More gold than they could reasonably use. And so one of the most remarkable trades in human history took shape. Salt from the north, gold from the south, meeting in the middle in the great trading cities of the Sahel, that strip of semi-arid land between the desert and the forest. Timbuktu, Jenny, Gao. These cities grew rich and powerful and famous from the traffic of these two substances moving in opposite directions. The exchange rates were, to a modern mind, almost unbelievable. Medieval travelers and Arab geographers reported that in the deep south, far from any source of salt, the mineral was traded weight for gold dust. A pound of salt for a pound of gold. It sounds like a fairy tale, but it made a certain kind of sense. If you are sitting on a river of gold but your children cannot eat their food without grimacing from the blandness, and your meat spoils within hours in the tropical heat, then gold is just a pretty metal and salt is survival. This trade made the rulers of Mali almost inconceivably wealthy. The most famous of these was Mansa Musa, the emperor who, in the 14th century, made a pilgrimage to Mecca. He traveled with an entourage of thousands and brought so much gold with him that when he passed through Cairo, his generous spending destabilized the local gold market for years. That gold came, in large part, from the salt for gold trade. Salt, carried across the burning desert on the backs of weary camels, was the engine that powered one of the greatest empires Africa has ever known. There is one detail of this trade that I find especially lovely, and I would like to linger on it for a while. It is called the silent trade, or sometimes the dumb barter. The practice was recorded by the ancient Greek historian Herodotus and later described in more detail by Arab geographers who traveled through West Africa. Here is how it worked. The salt merchants, the desert traders, would arrive at a designated spot, often a riverbank or a clearing in the forest. They would lay out their salt in neat piles, and then they would retreat. They would go back out of sight and wait. After some time, the local gold miners would emerge from the forest. They would approach the piles of salt and examine them. Then they would place a quantity of gold dust next to each pile, and then they, too, would retreat back into the trees, out of sight. The merchants would return. They would look at the gold. If they were satisfied with the amount, they would take the gold and leave the salt. The deal was done. If they were not satisfied, they would leave everything where it was, both the salt and the gold, and withdraw once more. The miners would come back. They would see that the gold had not been taken. They would understand, and they would add a little more gold dust to the pile. Then they would withdraw again, and so it continued, back and forth, offer and counter-offer, all without a single word being spoken, all without the two groups ever seeing each other face to face. This ritual served two important purposes. First, it bridged a language barrier between peoples who could not understand each other's speech. And second, it protected the secret locations of the gold mines, which the miners guarded with fierce determination. No merchant ever learned where the gold came from. The miners made sure of that. Trust in the silent trade was built not through conversation but through patience, through the slow, wordless rhythm of offer and acceptance, through the understanding that both sides needed what the other had, and that honesty, in the long run, served everyone better than trickery. It is, I think, one of the most quietly beautiful arrangements in all of human commerce. Two groups of strangers meeting at a riverbank in the heat of the African afternoon, trading the most valuable things they possess in perfect silence. Meanwhile, in the cold grey waters of northern Europe, a very different kind of salt trade was taking shape, and it was driven of all things by religion. The Catholic Church, throughout the medieval period, imposed strict dietary rules on the faithful on every Friday of the year, and during the entire season of Lent, those long weeks between Ash Wednesday and Easter, meat was forbidden. What the faithful could eat was fish, and so the demand for preserved fish that would not rot on the journey from the coast to the interior, was enormous. Staggering, really. Millions of people in hundreds of cities across Europe, all needing fish on the same days. The center of this trade was the Scania market, located at the southern tip of what is now Sweden, on the coast of the Öresund Strait. Every autumn, vast shoals of herring migrated through this narrow channel between Sweden and Denmark. The fish came in numbers that are difficult to comprehend, millions upon millions, so dense in the water that it was said you could scoop them up with your bare hands. But herring are delicate. They spoil almost instantly. Within hours of being caught, they begin to break down. The flesh softens, the smell turns, and so to preserve this extraordinary harvest for transport to the hungry cities of Catholic Europe, to Paris, to Cologne, to London, to Prague, you needed one thing above all: salt. The salt came from the mines of Lüneburg in northern Germany. Deep underground, Lüneburg sat atop a massive salt dome, and for centuries its mines produced the high-quality salt that preserved northern Europe's fish. And the merchants who controlled this salt supply, who held the keys to the Lüneburg mines and dictated the terms of their use, were the Hanseatic League. The Hanse was a confederation of trading cities, Lübeck, Hamburg, Bremen, Danzig, and dozens more that dominated the commerce of the Baltic and North Seas for nearly 300 years. Their power was built on many things, but salt was near the foundation. Control the salt, and you control the herring trade. Control the herring, and you feed Catholic Europe. Feed Catholic Europe, and you can dictate terms to kings. The League's hold on the salt-herring nexus made them extraordinarily wealthy. They built great merchant halls and churches in their cities. They maintained their own fleet of armed ships. They negotiated as equals with monarchs. For a time, the Hanseatic League was, in effect, a nation unto itself, a nation of merchants, bound together not by a common ruler, but by a common commodity. But nothing lasts forever. The herring are a reminder of that. In the 15th century, the great migration patterns began to shift. The herring moved away from the Öresund. The catches declined. And at the same time, Dutch fishermen discovered that they could use cheaper salt, bay salt, produced by solar evaporation on the warm coasts of France and Portugal, and cure their herring right there on the boats at sea without needing to bring the fish ashore and without depending on the Hanseatic supply chain. The League's monopoly began to crack, and with it, slowly their political power crumbled. Salt had built them up, and the loss of control over salt was the beginning of their long decline. Now, let us pause from empires and trade routes for a while. Let us slow down even further if that is possible. Let us sit down at the table, because salt has a quieter history too. A history not of armies and caravans, but of belief and superstition and small domestic rituals that have survived stubbornly for centuries. Across many cultures and many centuries, salt has been seen as something more than a mineral, something sacred, something powerful. And the reason, when you think about it, is rather simple. Salt preserves. It stops things from rotting. It holds back decay and dissolution and the slow return of living things to dust. And for people who believed in eternal life, in souls that outlast the body, in promises that should never be broken, this quality, this quiet chemical resistance to time was deeply, profoundly meaningful. In the Hebrew Bible, a covenant of salt was the most binding kind of promise. An agreement sealed with salt could not be broken. It was eternal, incorruptible, like the salt itself. In the Christian tradition, Jesus told his followers that they were the salt of the earth, meaning they were the preserving force, the ones who kept the world from moral and spiritual decay. If the salt loses its savor, he asked, what good is it? It was a warning, a responsibility. You are the salt. Do not go bland. In Japan, in the Shinto tradition, salt is used to purify spaces and drive away evil spirits. Before a sumo wrestling match, the wrestlers throw handfuls of salt into the ring, not for grip, not for show, but for purification. The salt cleanses the sacred space where the contest will take place. In Catholic liturgy too, salt has a role. It has been used in the rites of baptism and in the exorcism of water. Salt and holiness, it seems, are old and comfortable companions. But salt has a darker symbolism as well, because the same substance that preserves life can also destroy it. If you scatter salt across a field, the soil becomes toxic. Nothing will grow. The earth is sterilized. The biblical story of Abimelech, who conquered the city of Shechem and then sowed salt across its ruins, is a story of total, absolute negation. Not just military defeat, but the deliberate erasure of any possibility that life might return. This duality, the power to preserve and the power to destroy, the symbol of eternity and the instrument of annihilation, is what gives salt its peculiar weight in the human imagination. It is a substance of contradictions, a crystal that can save your life or ruin your land, holy and profane, all at once. Have you ever spilled salt and felt a small, irrational twinge of unease, a flicker of something, not quite superstition, but not quite nothing either? Many people have. The belief that spilling salt brings bad luck is ancient and remarkably persistent, even in a world that considers itself modern and rational. The superstition is often connected to a painting. Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper. If you look closely at the painting, and you may want to look it up sometime, you will notice that Judas Iscariot, the disciple who will betray Jesus, has knocked over a small salt cellar with his elbow. The overturned salt spills across the table in front of him. It is a visual omen, a foreshadowing of the betrayal to come. Spilled salt, wasted salt, as a harbinger of treachery. Whether Leonardo invented this symbolism or was simply depicting a belief that already existed in the popular imagination, we do not know for certain. But the remedy for spilled salt is well established, and it has been practiced for centuries. If you spill salt, you should take a pinch of it and throw it over your left shoulder. Why the left? Because in European folklore, the devil was believed to lurk behind the left shoulder. The word sinister itself comes from the Latin for left. The left side was the side of darkness, of bad intentions, of evil whispering in your ear. And so the purifying salt, flung over the left shoulder, was meant to strike the devil in the face, to blind him, to drive him away, to undo the curse that your clumsiness had invited. It is a small ritual. It takes half a second, and millions of people still do it, even if they would be embarrassed to explain why. There is one more piece of salt folklore that I find particularly haunting, and it comes from Haiti. In Haitian folklore, there is a tradition about zombies. Not the zombies of modern horror films, the groaning, shuffling creatures of Hollywood. These are different. In Haitian belief, a zombie is a person who has been raised from the dead by a sorcerer and made to serve as a mindless laborer. They are trapped in a kind of twilight state. They walk. They work. but they are not aware. They do not know they are dead. The belief holds that if you feed salt to a zombie, the taste of it will break the spell. The salt will restore their senses. They will suddenly become aware of where they are, aware of what has happened to them, aware that they are dead. And in that terrible clarifying moment, they will turn away from their master and walk back to their graves to lie down and be properly dead at last. Salt, even in the most extraordinary stories of the supernatural, is the substance that brings you back to reality. The taste that wakes you up. In medieval England, salt played a quieter but no less meaningful role as a marker of social hierarchy. In the great dining halls of the nobility, where long tables were set for feasts, a large and ornate salt cellar, sometimes called a standing salt or a master salt, often made of silver, sometimes gilded, sometimes quite tall and elaborate, was placed in the center of the high table. The host sat at one end. Guests of high rank, lords, bishops, distinguished visitors, sat between the host and the salt cellar. This was called sitting above the salt. It meant you were important, honored, welcome at the inner circle. Those of lower rank, minor officials, distant relatives, servants of gentlemen, people whose presence was tolerated but not celebrated, sat on the other side of the salt cellar, below the salt. And everyone at the table knew exactly what this spatial arrangement meant. The salt told you your place in the world. It was a social thermometer, sitting in a silver vessel in the middle of the table, measuring your worth in inches. And in the kitchen, far from the ceremony of the great hall, salt was often kept in a homely vessel called a salt pig, a rounded, hooded pot made of earthenware with a wide opening for scooping. The name is charming, and the shape does resemble, if you squint, a small plump piglet resting on its side. But linguists suspect the word has nothing to do with the animal at all. In Scots and in the dialects of northern England, the word pig, or pig, simply meant an earthenware vessel, a crock, a pot, a container made of fired clay. The salt pig was just a salt pot, named in a dialect that has mostly faded from common use. But the word and the shape remain. For thousands of years, the story of salt was a story of effort, of scarcity, of labor. You boiled brine over smoky fires, day after day. You dug mines with hand tools by lamplight, deep underground. You loaded heavy slabs onto the backs of camels and walked them across burning deserts. You sailed ships across cold northern seas with holds full of salted herring. Salt was valuable precisely because it was so hard to get in the quantities that people needed. And then the world changed. The Industrial Revolution, that great upheaval of the 18th and 19th centuries, transformed everything. The way people worked, the way goods were made, the speed of travel, the scale of production. And salt, humble, ancient, essential salt, was not exempt from this transformation. The key invention was the vacuum pan evaporator, originally developed by an engineer named Norbert Rilliot for the sugar industry. Rilliot was a free man of color from New Orleans, and his system was elegant in its efficiency. It worked by boiling liquid under reduced atmospheric pressure. When you lower the pressure, you lower the boiling point. Water will turn to steam at a lower temperature, which means you need less fuel, and the steam that rises can be captured and used to heat the next batch. So the energy is recycled rather than wasted. When this technology was applied to salt production, the results were transformative. The vacuum pan produced crystals of extraordinary purity and uniformity, far cleaner and more consistent than anything that had come from an open fire and a clay pot. Combined with steam-powered drills and modern hydraulic mining techniques, the vacuum pan caused the price of salt to fall, and fall, and fall. What had been a precious commodity, fought over by empires, smuggled at the risk of death, traded weight for gold, became one of the cheapest substances on Earth, available to anyone in any quantity for almost nothing. The great salt scarcities of history were over, but even as salt became cheap to eat, its industrial importance soared. In 1861, a Belgian chemist named Ernest Solvay patented a new process for converting ordinary sodium chloride, table salt, into sodium carbonate, also known as soda ash. The process used ammonia as a chemical intermediary, and it was far more efficient and far less polluting than the older Leblanc process that it replaced. Now, soda ash may not be the most thrilling chemical compound you have ever heard of, but it is essential to modern life in ways you might not realize. It is used to make glass, windows, bottles, eyeglasses, the screen you might be watching this on. It is used to make soap. It is used to make paper. It is used in the manufacture of detergents, in water treatment, in the production of dozens of everyday materials. By 1900, the Solvay process accounted for 95% of the world's soda ash production. 95%. And every single batch started with salt. This was the moment when salt's identity shifted permanently. For all of human history, salt had been primarily about food, about flavoring and preservation, and the slow curing of meat and fish. But now, the vast majority of salt produced in the world was no longer being eaten at all. It was being poured onto icy roads in winter to keep cars from skidding. It was being fed into enormous chemical plants to produce chlorine, caustic soda, and dozens of industrial chemicals. Salt had become a feedstock, a raw material, the unglamorous, invisible backbone of modern manufacturing. And yet, despite this transformation, salt still had one more great political moment left. In British India, the colonial government maintained a strict monopoly on salt production. The manufacture, transport, and sale of salt were all controlled by the Crown. The salt tax was heavy, and it fell hardest on the poorest people in the country, the hundreds of millions who could not afford to pay the government's price for something their bodies could not live without. It was, in its way, a mirror of the French gabelle transposed to a far larger stage, a tax on necessity imposed by the powerful upon the powerless. In 1930, Mahatma Gandhi chose this tax as the focal point of his most famous act of civil disobedience. He announced that he would walk, not ride, not drive, but walk, from his ashram near the city of Ahmedabad to the coast of the Arabian Sea, a distance of 240 miles. And when he reached the sea, he would make salt. He would pick it up from the mud, a criminal act under British law. The march took 24 days. Gandhi walked with a growing crowd of followers, passing through villages and towns. People came out to watch. Some joined the march. The newspapers covered every step. The British authorities were unsure how to respond to an elderly man in a loincloth, walking slowly toward the beach. On the 6th of April, 1930, Gandhi arrived at a tiny coastal village called Dandi. He waded into the shallow water, and he picked up a lump of natural salt from the mud. That simple act, the act of bending down and picking up salt from the earth, electrified India. Across the country, millions of ordinary people began making their own salt, boiling seawater, scraping it from tidal flats in deliberate defiance of British law. Over 60,000 people were arrested. The jails overflowed. The British authorities found themselves in the absurd and embarrassing position of imprisoning people, men, women, the elderly, for possessing salt. The Salt March did not, on its own end, British rule. That would take another 17 years. But it broke something. It shattered the illusion that the colonial government's authority was unchallengeable. It showed that a simple, non-violent act, rooted in the most basic human need, could shake an empire to its foundations. Salt, 2,000 years after the Chinese emperors first taxed it, still had the power to change history. In the early 20th century, a quieter crisis was unfolding, one that most people did not even recognize as a crisis at the time. Across parts of the United States, particularly the Great Lakes region and the Pacific Northwest, and in certain alpine valleys of Switzerland, people were suffering from a condition called endemic goiter. The thyroid gland in the neck would swell, sometimes enormously. In mild cases, it was a visible lump. In severe cases, the goiter could grow to the size of a grapefruit, distorting the neck and pressing on the windpipe. And in its most devastating form, iodine deficiency in pregnant women caused a condition in their children called cretinism, a profound developmental disability affecting both body and mind. The cause was geological. The soils in these regions, scoured clean by ancient glaciers, were deficient in iodine, a trace element that the thyroid gland needs to produce its hormones. The crops that grew in iodine-poor soil were themselves iodine-poor. The animals that ate those crops were iodine-poor, and the people who ate the animals and the crops did not get enough iodine, and their thyroids swelled in a futile effort to capture every last molecule. The solution came from a doctor named David Murray Cowie, who was inspired by experiments that had already shown promising results in Switzerland. Cowie realized something elegant. Everyone eats salt every day, without exception. The rich eat salt. The poor eat salt. City dwellers and farmers and children and the elderly. If you added a tiny amount of iodine to the salt supply, you would reach the entire population automatically without requiring anyone to change their behavior or visit a doctor. He convinced the Morton Salt Company to add a minute quantity of potassium iodide to their product. It was almost nothing, a few parts per million. You could not taste it. You could not see it. But it was enough. On the 1st of May, 1924, iodized salt appeared on the shelves of stores in Michigan. The results were dramatic and swift. Goiter rates plummeted. Within a generation, endemic goiter was virtually eliminated in the regions that adopted iodized salt, and studies conducted in later decades showed that average cognitive performance in iodine-deficient areas rose significantly. Children were healthier, sharper, more capable, simply because a trace of iodine had been added to something everyone already ate. It remains one of the most cost-effective public health interventions in the history of medicine. Pennies per person. A pinch of mineral in a pinch of salt. And a whole generation of suffering, quietly, almost invisibly, ended. The Morton Salt Company also solved another, smaller, but endearingly relatable problem. Salt clumps? Salt is hygroscopic. It absorbs moisture from the air. In humid weather, the crystals stick together, forming hard lumps in the container. Every cook in history had experienced this frustration, reaching for the salt and finding a solid block instead of a free-flowing stream. In 1911, Morton added a small amount of magnesium carbonate to their salt as an anti-caking agent. Later, they switched to calcium silicate, which worked even better. The salt flowed freely, even on the dampest day. It poured when you shook it, no matter the weather. And their advertising campaign for this innovation became one of the most enduring in American history. A little girl in a yellow dress walking in the rain. She carries an umbrella under one arm and a container of Morton salt under the other. The salt is pouring out behind her, freely, unbothered by the downpour. And the slogan reads, "When it rains it pours." It is a gentle, clever inversion of the old proverb. It never rains but it pours, meaning that bad luck comes all at once, in a flood. Morton took the proverb and turned it on its head. Their salt pours reliably, even in a storm. Steady, dependable. A small promise made by a picture of a little girl and an umbrella, but a comforting one. And so here we are, at the end of a very long story. A story that began in a sense before there were people to tell it. We began in the deep past, with ancient oceans evaporating under a sun that shone on a world without humans. We watched as the salt from those oceans settled layer by layer on the floor of shallow seas that no longer exist. We followed it as it was buried under miles of sedimentary rock, squeezed and pressed for hundreds of millions of years, pushed upward through the crust in great columns of white crystal. We followed animals, deer, elephants, cattle, to their salt licks, and we followed the trails those animals wore into the earth with their patient, heavy hooves. Trails that became paths, and paths that became the first roads. We stood in the forests of Romania 8,000 years ago and watched as someone poured brine into a clay pot and set it carefully over a fire. We watched the water boil away and the salt appear white and glistening inside the broken shards of pottery. We descended into the wells of Sichuan, 1,000 meters deep, lit by the blue glow of natural gas. We watched men jump on wooden planks, again and again, driving an iron bit deeper into the rock. We heard the soft creak of bamboo cables and the hiss of brine rising to the surface. We walked the Via Salaria with the Romans, carrying salt from the sea to the hills. We sat in the embalming workshops of Egypt and watched the natron do its slow, patient work. We stood on the docks of Lothal in the Indus Valley as salt was loaded onto boats bound for Mohenjo-Daro. We crossed the Sahara with a caravan of 1,000 camels, carrying slabs of salt toward the gold markets of Timbuktu. We stood in silence at the riverbank and watched the wordless dance of the silent trade. We sat in the chapel of St. Kinga at Velichka, surrounded by salt, 100 meters underground, and looked up at chandeliers made of crystal. We watched smugglers in France risk everything for a bag of white mineral. We stood on the windswept docks of the Scania market as the herring came in, countless silver bodies pulled from the cold northern sea, destined to be packed in salt and shipped to the fasting cities of Christendom. We witnessed a woman dressed as a goddess in the shadow of an Aztec temple. We felt the sting of a 70-year blockade. We heard the gentle boiling of brine in a Maya salt kitchen hidden in a mangrove lagoon. We watched an old man in India walk 240 miles to the sea, and we watched the world shift just slightly because he bent down and picked up a handful of mud. Salt is abundant now. It costs almost nothing. You can buy a container of it at the store for less than the price of a cup of coffee, and it will last you for months. We live in a world where the problem is not too little salt, but too much. Doctors tell us to cut back. Nutritionists warn us about our sodium intake. The great salt scarcities, the salt wars, the salt smugglers, the salt taxes, they belong to another time. A time that feels impossibly distant from the world of refrigerators and supermarkets and health guidelines. And yet, every time you reach for the salt shaker, that small, familiar gesture, you are participating in something very old. Older than writing, older than cities, older than agriculture itself. You are answering the same biological call that sent the deer to the mineral lick and the elephant to the hillside. You are satisfying a craving that is woven into the deepest layers of your body's chemistry. And the substance on your tongue, sodium chloride, NaCl, common salt, is the same compound that crystallized on the floor of a vanished ocean 200 million years ago. It has been mined and traded and taxed and fought over and worshipped and smuggled and marched for. It has preserved the bodies of pharaohs and the herring of northern Europe. It has funded empires and toppled governments. It has been worth its weight in gold. And now it sits in a small glass shaker on your kitchen table, patiently waiting for dinner. Every grain is a tiny artifact, a piece of deep geological time, dissolved on your tongue and absorbed into your blood, where it joins the ancient saline current that has flowed through every living body since life first stirred in the shallow, sunlit water of a very young planet. We are, all of us, creatures of the salt. We have always been. We always will be. And that is the boring history of salt. I hope you found it quietly interesting, or perhaps quietly soothing. And if you drifted off somewhere along the way, somewhere between the camels and the herring, or during the slow decades of the French gabelle, then I am glad. That is rather the point. Thank you for listening. Rest well tonight, and the next time you see that small white shaker sitting on your table, perhaps you will think of it a little differently. Perhaps you will think of the ancient oceans and the Romanian pottery and the bamboo cables of Sichuan and the silent riverbanks of West Africa and the little girl with the umbrella walking in the rain. Or perhaps you will simply shake a little salt onto your food and carry on with your evening. That is fine too. The salt does not mind. It has been patient for a very long time. Good night.